Hatebase is a Toronto startup that uses natural language processing to help companies read their ecosystem of hate speech, while also helping government agencies, law enforcement, and NGOs perform threat assessment in conflict areas. This talk will focus on some of the challenges Hatebase has encountered in analyzing online conversation while balancing users' expectations of free speech against government's regulatory crackdown on hate speech, as well as on opportunities for future innovation in the field of content moderation. Timothy is a co-founding principal of Hatebase, as well as Chief Technology Officer of the government procurement platform, OMX. He's an advisor to several organizations, including the United Nations, the International Development Research Center, NeedsList, and the Canadian Executive Service Organization. He now has an extra title to add on his resume, maybe the most important, and that is AI Geek Speaker. So we'd like to invite Timothy to tell us more. Oh, we should be on.
Excellent. You guys hear me okay?
Can we get the mic?
How about now? Oh, better. All right. So I thought I was going to come up here and depress the hell out of you, but we've been talking about Cambridge Analytica, and so I feel we're kind of in the right headspace. And I appreciate that. So at the risk of belaboring the obvious, I'm going to talk a little bit about hate speech, and you're probably going to see and hear some offensive content. I always put this up, but I know it would seem obvious, but I just want to make you aware that you will probably not see anything you haven't seen before, but it might get a little blue. Okay. So by most measures, hate speech is on the rise. And I would ask you to look at this data with a little bit of skepticism, because obviously all online conversation is increasing all the time, and so hate speech increases with it. And by the same token, when you see studies like this, which makes, for a great headline, it's always good to look at the sample size, and sometimes you find out that it's not quite as revelatory as you might think. But all these issues aside, qualitatively and quantitatively, there seems to be a consensus that hate speech is on the rise. And no surprise, a lot of that is happening in the social media space. In fact, I think if you were to design a hate speech generator, you would have a hard time designing something better than Twitter. And I don't mean that as a slight against Twitter. I use Twitter. I like Twitter. But it's open and has a bit of a libertarian bent, and it really encourages short, facile communication. So to me, that seems like the perfect engine for disseminating hate speech. And this is why that's a problem. So what you're looking at here is a study that came out of the University of Warwick last year, I believe. And what they looked at was the relationship between hate speech. Whoops, we lost it. There we go. Hate speech against immigrants in Germany between 2015 and 2017, and they married that up against reported hate crimes against immigrants in Germany over that same. And when you look at it, it's you can hardly imagine a more perfect synchronicity between the two. So there are a variety of studies that show very similar, and this was actually based on our data and several other data sets, so nobody was cooking the books. But there is quite a bit of research now that suggests that there is a correlation between hate speech and hate crime. And so violence is one reason to be aware of this problem. What about hate speech that doesn't bleed over into the offline world, that doesn't actually translate into violence? Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem for a lot of reasons. For one thing, it causes non-hateful users to walk away, and when they walk away, that causes advertisers to walk away. Increasingly, there are really stiff regulatory penalties in countries around the world. Most people have heard about Germany, 50 million for posts that are not removed within a week of notification. UK, France, Australia, all following up with pretty stiff regulations against social networks. And finally, it's just tremendously demotivating if you're a developer in a social network, if you are, God forbid, a moderator in a social network and you're looking at this stuff day after day, to that point, it is the worst job ever. And I'm sure most of you have read about this. A lot of this stuff causes tremendous trauma to the people who have to look at it. And because it's so unpleasant and because it's so poorly paid, companies farm this stuff out to the other side of the world where there's a low standard of living. They can do it very cheaply. There aren't a lot of labor regulations. They can get away with having people look at the most heinous stuff imaginable for 12 hours a day. So that's a good reason why you shouldn't be doing this stuff manually. Unfortunately, automation isn't yet at the point where it's prevalent or particularly effective. What you're looking at right here is actually probably one of the higher ratios of automated to manual moderation. This is Facebook. The most recent data that I've got here is the end of last year when they're doing just over 50% automated moderation. That's for all of Facebook, just over 50%, and that's a good number. So why is it so damn difficult? That's really what I want to talk about. There are a number of challenges when you're trying to do hate speech moderation, and the first one, and in some sense the toughest one, is trying to figure out what exactly you mean when you talk about hate speech. And if you ask a dozen different people what is hate speech, you're going to get a dozen different answers. Even if you ask people who work professionally with hate speech, you're going to get a dozen different types of nuance on what is hate speech. And in actual fact, it tends to be defined by the purposes for which you're moderating. All of these definitions of hate speech are problematic. You can probably imagine why each one is problematic. When you start defining hate speech as criticism, then potentially you're shutting down dissent. You're potentially shutting down conversation. When you define hate speech as humor, where do you draw the line there? Like, is it like the most benign humor that maybe marginalizes a group of people? I mean, you look at somebody like a comedian like Jerry Seinfeld, who has made a career out of clean comedy, but he pokes fun at the disabled. So you certainly wouldn't want to consider that hate speech. So it's really tough to know where to draw that line. And it's actually very reminiscent of in the 80s when we were trying to figure out what the hell is pornography. And the closest we could get was Justice Stewart saying, "I know when I see it." And obviously that's not particularly helpful for machines. A lot of organizations will define hate speech as that which causes violence. And in fact, most peacekeeping organizations will use a definition. The UN uses that, the Council of Europe uses that, and there are good and bad things about using a violence-based definition of hate speech. The good news is it's potentially actionable. Something's happening in a specific time, a specific place, and then potentially you can mitigate against that in some fashion. The disadvantage is it doesn't really do anything about stuff that happens just online. It doesn't do anything about cyberbullying. It doesn't do anything about the really horrible stuff that doesn't bleed off into the offline world. And of course, hate speech is, as I implied earlier, to a large degree in the eye of the beholder. And so people tend to use hate speech as a way of shutting down things that they don't like. And then you get a very vanilla definition of hate speech. And you blur the line between criticism and parody and dislike. So for instance, I'm of Irish extraction. So is St. Patrick's Day hateful? Of course not. That's ridiculous. Well, what about a few years ago, J. Crew had a T-shirt that they pulled because it had a map of Ireland on it, and the regions were labeled as beer and more beer. And okay, is that offensive to the Irish? I'm not offended by that. Is the paddy wagon, which is, there's a little bit of a denigration involved in the relationship between law enforcement and the Irish there. What about last year, the GOP tweeted a photo of Beto O'Rourke, his drunk driving arrest mugshot, with a leprechaun hat. Stupid, I know, but now we're starting to move down that slippery slope and trying to figure out exactly where we want to draw the line with hate speech. So the challenge is that it actually represents a whole bunch of different types of language, from denigrating language and disparaging language to generalization, which could be positive, could be negative, it's still generalization. Dangerous speech is a term that you'll hear a lot in peacekeeping circles. It's speech that leads to violence. And then you get into symbolic hate speech, swastikas spray painted on walls. We have a definition at Hatebase that we use. You have to have a definition if you're going to do monitoring, and this is ours. Any expression or terminology which characterizes a group based on certain subjective attributes, particularly around ethnicity, nationality, religion, sexuality, disability, or class, irregardless of offensiveness. And the reason that we take offensiveness out of that definition is because we're trying to take as much subjectivity out of it as possible so that we can actually use it as a tool for measurement. So the second challenge is a technological challenge. And this is when we're trying to deal primarily with stuff on social media where we have little snippets of content that we're trying to analyze. We don't know who's saying it. A lot of times we don't know where it's being said. We don't know the group identity of the speaker, the recipient, the person being spoken about. There's some degree of sentiment analysis that you can do, but that gets really, really tough when you have little bits of text. And then you get words that drift back and forth between languages. Then you get homonyms and misspellings, and increasingly we're starting to see obfuscation, deliberate, occasionally accidental, but mainly deliberate obfuscation of terminology to get past content filters. And so what all of these challenges have in common is context. If you don't know the context, it's very hard to say this is hate speech and that is not. And it's very hard to teach a machine to do that. So I love to give this example. This is a term used in Nigeria. When a Hausa talks to another Hausa and uses the term aboki, he's referring to his friend. When a non-Hausa talks about a Hausa and uses the exact same word, he's saying rube or uneducated or unsophisticated. Same word, same language, same region. This is what makes it really, really tough. This is another example that I love to share. This is a tweet from last year where Louis Farrakhan, who is endlessly doing his weird dance about whether he's an anti-Semite or not, as though there were any doubt left in anybody's mind, he says, "I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm anti-termite." Now, as human beings looking at this, we know exactly what he's saying. Of course it's an anti-Semitic remark. But for a machine, this is really, really difficult to tease out. And so this is what we work on, this class of problem. The third challenge that we have trying to do hate speech monitoring is access to data. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Twitter is a great repository of open data that we can mine, but we don't have that luxury with a lot of other data out there. And so we really look for that sweet spot between public data and structured data that we can work with. But increasingly, as the internet migrates towards walled gardens, a small number of walled gardens, it's very hard to get access to that sort of data. This is specifically geared to the big data folks in the room, because whenever I leave these slides out whenever I give this presentation to folks in the humanitarian community. Obviously, when you deal with large amounts of data, you get all kinds of artifacting. Raw data is rife with artifacts that you have to take out. I just want to talk about 6 big artifacts that we deal with. The first one is granularity. When we're dealing with a lot of hate speech data and you zoom in too much and you try and pull meaning out of a small amount of data, then you can very easily draw the wrong conclusions. When you're trying to take a small amount of data and then say, well, this means that you're going to have a heightened risk with the election around the corner, it's hard to make that kind of conclusion when you've got a very small amount. It's like zooming in on a photo to where it pixelates. A volume artifact is very similar. You've got a lot more data. In fact, you've got so much data that you think you got the whole picture, and then you start realizing, well, wait a minute. There's a whole hell of a lot more conversation that I'm not looking at. So this big data that I'm looking at is actually very small data, relatively speaking. We deal a lot with geolocation artifacting. Most of the data that we try and capture, we try and figure out where it happens, not just when it happens, because that makes it actionable. When you capture geolocation data, again, it's easy to fool yourself and think that, well, I have a very good idea of what's happening in this specific place, even though there may be a whole lot of data around that hasn't been geocoded, hasn't been properly geocoded, which tells a very different story. And so again, it's a little bit of a muse that can trick you when you start geolocating. You're also, obviously, you get into issues of, am I talking about where the person is? Am I talking about where the person's profile is? Am I talking about where the person's device is? You get into all those sorts of things. And again, it's very easy to draw false conclusions. Evolutionary artifacts, I won't spend too much more time on these. Evolutionary artifacts, our technology is, we hope, constantly getting smarter. And as a result, we have to compare data done with the latest version of HateBrain, our natural language processor, with data that was generated 3 years ago by an earlier version. And while we try and go back and constantly reassess, there's just too much goddamn data to do that. And so you're trying to measure both of these with the same index, which can be challenging. Technological artifacts, if you were to look at Hatebase and figure out, well, listen, there's this much hate speech in South Sudan right now, and there's this much hate speech in Canada right now. Forget South Sudan. Oh my God, Canada is about to have a civil war. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense. You've got more data on Canada because there's more internet adoption in Canada. And so you have to bear that in mind as well. Similarly, cultural artifacts, different people in different countries and different cultures report things different ways. And so again, that can seriously skew your data. So all of these may seem like daunting problems, but they're not unsolvable. So why haven't they been solved? Our perspective is that we're never going to solve the online hate speech problem until it's really as easy as other stuff you do online, like validating an email address or displaying a map or doing antivirus. Until it's that easy, there's going to continue to be a massive hate speech problem online. And so we really believe that hate speech should be a service. And so we consider ourselves a hate speech as a service company, an HSAS company. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about us specifically. We are a large repository of multilingual regionalized hate speech. And regionalization, as I said before, is really, really important to us because if you don't know where something happened, it's really hard to take any kind of action on it. We work with a variety of public and private entities. We work with government agencies from the federal level down to the municipal level, increasingly at the municipal level. We work with law enforcement. We work with 4 of the world's 10 largest social networks are pulling our data. We work with academia. We have researchers from, Oxford, Princeton, Harvard, Cornell, 350 universities around the world are pulling the data and doing interesting research like we saw earlier with the University of Warwick. And those are some of the ones who are using us right now. So what are they doing with all this data? On the nonprofit and government side, for the most part, they're trying to do threat indexing. They're trying to figure out what's going on in a certain region that might cause them to redirect resources to the hottest hotspot. And that was certainly why we initially developed the technology. The platform was developed 8 years ago in conjunction with a Canadian NGO that was trying to do early warning monitoring of mass atrocities in Kenya, Myanmar, South Sudan, places like that. And we figured, well, hate speech is quantifiable. So if we can measure that, knowing that we have a small number of people, small number of dollars, we can't solve every problem around the world. How do we know where to put those dollars? We figured this was one thing that we could do from a quantifiable perspective, is try and figure out how to triage. So that's what a lot of governments and NGOs are using us for. And then, of course, the social networks and online ecosystems, this is what they're using us for. They're using us for content moderation. And so our goal is not to automate all hate speech moderation. That would be a ridiculous, unachievable goal. But our goal is to move that line as far down the funnel as we can and automate as much as we can of the worst of the worst. How we do that is we have a natural language processing engine, which we call HateBrain. And what HateBrain does is it looks at content, and it's getting smarter and smarter at identifying things like context, obfuscation, which, as I mentioned before, we're increasingly seeing, particularly in the white nationalist movement. So they'll use leet speak, they'll use dog whistles, they'll use creative punctuation, they'll use just about anything they possibly can to get past content filters, most of which, by the way, are crap. We see homonyms all the time. Any short word in any language, I guarantee you, is a completely different short word in another language. And so again, our NLP is getting smarter and smarter at spotting that stuff. We want to make sure that we don't shut down clinical discussion of hate speech. And so we're increasingly trying to make our technology smarter about knowing when people are talking about a word rather than using a word. And so the final thing that we've been doing a lot of recently is collecting a lexicon of what we call pilotfish. For those marine biologists in the room, this will be very familiar. Pilotfish are the little fish that swim alongside sharks and have a symbiotic relationship. And so our pilotfish are not hate speech, but they are terms and memes and emoji and things that are statistically likely to accompany hate speech. And you'll see a few of them here. This is basically how our NLP looks at a piece of social media content. It looks for xenophobic references. It knows what that is. It looks for intensifiers, looks for certain emojis, obfuscation, negativity. It does a little bit of sentiment analysis. And this is how a company will generally use us. And I'm just going to cruise through this here. We generally encourage our clients to create a local data store of our lexicon. And then on a nightly or weekly basis, they pull all of our vocabulary, put it in their own system. And then once it's there, it's just sitting there waiting to be used. And then maybe somebody on their platform, let's say we're talking about TikTok. TikTok is a recent client of ours. Let's say a TikTok user flags another TikTok user's comment as hate speech or worthy of moderation. And then that triggers a workflow. It may be also that you don't need that flagging. Maybe TikTok knows that this guy, they've flagged him before, and they're going to keep an eye on everything he writes. Either way, some sort of event triggers a workflow whereby they take our local data store, our local lexicon, and they just do a quick keyword match. Is it even in the realm possibility that this actually is something that we want to moderate on our platform? And they're going to get either a yes or a no. There's a small chance it's a yes. We actually have in our lexicon a small number of terms that are unambiguous. If you see them, it's hate speech. There's no two ways about it, but that's the minority. The overwhelming majority of vocabulary in our lexicon has multiple meanings. And so in that case, they may decide to come back to our NLP through our API and send us the content and have us actually analyze it and send back true, false, or unknown. And if it's true, we give a probability, somewhere between 50 and 100%. So I want to wrap up here because I know I'm running out of time. One of the challenges that I didn't mention, this is the bonus challenge, is trying to figure out where the hell to draw the line between hate speech and free speech. And again, everybody has an opinion on this. There are a lot of very valid opinions on when and where you should apply moderation. We personally do not support censorship. We're much more on the side of counter messaging and education. It's a lot better to keep something up and mock it and criticize it and show why it's wrong and engage in a dialogue about why it's wrong than it is to just yank it offline. Because then all you're really doing is you're getting rid of the expression of hate, but the hate is still there. However, that said, so this is our perfect world. This is our position. There are 3 exceptions to that rule that we foresee. One is that I think it's very easy to forget that the social networks of the world are private companies and that the law doesn't quite function the same way with a social network as it does out in the civic commons. And so they have every right, if they don't like the looks of you, if they don't like what you're saying, they can pull you off. And it's very similar to if somebody were to walk into my home and make some sort of racial slur against me or my family, I wouldn't have the right to pick up the phone and call the police and have them arrested, but I sure as hell have the right to ask them to leave my home. And it's the same thing with social networks. So that's one exception, is that you don't necessarily have the same right to free speech on a private company or a private ecosystem. The second exception is when it leads to violence. And there is a right, and I would argue a responsibility of government and law enforcement when there is a high possibility of an imminent threat, and I'm talking about the active shooter scenario that social networks are now actively looking for, that there is a cause at that point to intercede in some fashion. And then the third exception, whenever whenever people talk about censorship, they think about it in a very black and white terms. Here's content is taken away, but they don't think about what happens when you leave content up and then it causes people to self-censor. And for those of you who remember Gamergate not that long ago, a lot of female voices just went offline because they got tired of being harassed and threatened and abused online. And I would argue that that's a form of censorship as well. Okay, last slide, I promise. So these are some areas that we see potential future developments, certainly things that we're working on and that we would encourage anybody else who's interested in this field to think about and pursue. And the first is just metadata. We're increasingly building our lexicon so that it's publicly available to organizations who want to do hate speech monitoring. We have a pretty good sized multilingual lexicon, about 97 languages across nearly 200 countries. I'm convinced that's a drop in the bucket, and so I think there's a lot of opportunity not only to build more language, but more metadata around that language. Where is it used? How is it used? Multiple insights into how that context can be applied in real-world scenarios. So there's definitely an opportunity there. Location-based monitoring. As I said before, it matters so much to know not just when somebody said something, but where it was said. Context is so dependent on geography, and so the more that I have very limited means if I get a piece of text through an API to know where that was said. But if that's coming from a social network and they have a relationship with that user and they do know where it was said, they should be using that data to better moderate their own processes. Smarter natural language processing, we're working on ours. I hope other people are working on theirs. We're focusing a lot, as I said before, on deobfuscation. And then finally, behavioral analysis, because hate speech is not, it's one of these things that generally doesn't happen just once. And so if you see it happening over and over again, and we've been thinking more and more about hate speech as a security threat, not a policy threat per se, or a content as an actual security threat, no different than somebody hacking into the back of your network. And if you can actually start seeing how people react when they're posting hate speech, and you can start actually looking at behavioral patterns, I think there's a tremendous opportunity there to do good work and spot stuff in a timely manner. So that's it. And I apologize, I've gone through this stuff very, very quickly. There were a lot of visuals. I know it's a very heavy and depressing topic, but I'm happy to talk further about it if anybody has any questions, either here or if you want to grab my business card, I will talk about this stuff anytime, anywhere.
Thank you very much. We have time for 2 questions. Let me give the mic. Yeah. And we are openly biased against men, so we'll ask the ladies if they have a question. Without hate, though.
I can take it. It's fine.
Thank you for a nice presentation. I have a question. As you mentioned, the differentiation between the free speech is difficult from the hate speech. How do you label your data, the data that is you collected? Who is responsible for the labeling?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we actually have a multi-tiered editorial process. We have 2 different types of data, really. We have vocabulary data, our lexicon, and then every few minutes we take that lexicon and we go out on the internet and we look for incidents of the usage of that lexicon, which is our second data set, sightings. So how we moderate that, we actually have multiple tiers of moderation. We have a crew of citizen linguists, about 70 of them right now, all around the world, who have expertise in specific regions, specific languages around the world. We also have relationships with NGOs all around the world. We had some great help this year from Burmese experts in the United Nations who had been actively involved with the Rohingya crisis. And so we were able to benefit a lot from their linguistic expertise and knowing when this term is used, there's a chance it means this or there's a chance it means this. And so what we do is we try and label as much as possible expansively. These are the various definitions, and here are some things to look for that might tell you that it's being used in this context as opposed to that. Does that help at all?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I guess the only other thing I'll mention is that we do try and make it as transparent a process as possible. We make all of the data available. 90% of our use cases are completely free, and they're paid for by the commercial use cases, which is a small amount of our business. So the social networks basically pay for the NGOs.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, we have one more here.
Great, thank you.
One more.
Just a quick question. So,
Of course.
does each company that you guys work with have their own threshold of
Yes.
what they consider a hate crime? And then do you guys also advise, like have a standardized?
So that's a good question. So we're data people. We're not analysts. We're not statisticians. We're not advocates. We're just data people. And so what we do is we make data available to people who can do that level of analysis, and we try not to go too far down that road, because arguably it's contextual to the situation that you're monitoring. So it would be inappropriate for me to say, telling a group that's actively working with South Sudanese in Uganda and dealing with hate speech in refugee camps, it would be inappropriate for me to tell them, you should be looking at this or that. We just make the data available to them.
Do you find like our generation's super sensitive now, or you have to be very unbiased to like?
Yeah, you definitely have to be as unbiased as possible. It's very similar to another question I often get, which is how do you not be jaded? And I guess we all have humanitarian backgrounds. We've all done work in conflict zones. We've all seen some pretty horrible things, and I think you just get to the point where somebody who works in the medical field, you can't get upset about every patient. At some point you have to step back and you have to think about, well, what's the best thing for society at large? And that's the mindset that we try to keep in mind.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony.